say. You say, Pastor, you don't know what you're talking about because you went to a Christian high school and you went to a Bible college and you've been in the ministry now full time for 9 years, and you're kind of out of touch. Let me tell you how far out of touch I am. I can remember growing up as a boy, my paternal grandfather drank Pabst Blue Ribbon, my father drank Fall City, and my maternal grandfather drank Stroh's. Before the Lord saved my parents and we got into a good church that believed the Bible and got that mess and junk out of our lives, almost every weekend, the Saturday routine was for Mother to go by the ABC store and make their purchase for their evening of celebration and festivity, just celebrating a weekend, and putting her 3 children in the care of a babysitter at home. And Mom and Dad would go out and they would have their fun. And I had great, wonderful, loving, caring parents. They never neglected me for a minute. I'm not criticizing them. They were unsaved and they acted like unsaved people. And so the challenge is, if you are a Christian, you don't act like unsaved people. In fact, the thing that got my family out of that lifestyle into the church where my parents were converted and later on I was converted and called into ministry was one of those evenings in the care of a babysitter. But I'll tell that story another time. My grandfather was an alcoholic. He died at 64 years of age through liver disease and throat cancer. I loved my maternal grandparents. Grandpa had an eye put out in a coal mining accident right about the time my mother was pregnant with me. My parents were married, very poor, like many of you started out. And for the first year of their marriage, we lived with my maternal grandparents. And I was born during that time, and Grandpa was out of work during that time. And I don't need to tell you how close I was to my maternal grandfather. Loved him dearly, still love him. But Grandfather was an alcoholic. It was not unusual for him to get up, pour a cup half full of black coffee and fill it up the rest of the way with straight whiskey. And that was his morning. Never saw him very often that he didn't have a can of Stroh's beer in his hand. He wasn't drunk most of the time that I saw him, and he wasn't ever mean when he was drunk. But I think I know what I'm talking about. I watched 2 football games yesterday, Carolina and Pittsburgh, and Boston College and Southern Cal. I didn't care who won. As they say, I didn't have a dog in the fight. When it comes to this topic, I've got a dog in the fight. I've seen the devastation. I've seen the destruction. I know what I'm talking about. Every Thursday of my life, I would call my maternal grandparents, and I would say, can I get off the school bus at your house tomorrow and spend Friday night at your house? And most often, Grandmother would say yes. Grandpa, again, he was as loving, as kind as he could be. Never heard him raise his voice, never saw him demonstrate any kind of violent behavior at all. But he would go off and he would drink with his friends. And my grandparents lived in town, even in West Virginia. It was town. They didn't have a driveway. And you had to park along the street. Grandpa loved big cars, big Plymouths and Chryslers. He'd drive that big Plymouth, and he'd go downtown, and he'd drink, and he'd come home. And I'd get up that next morning, I'd look outside. His car might be half in the yard and half on the street. My mom's sister lived across the street from my grandparents. I saw his car one morning completely in the middle of her yard. I guess that was the safest place. He drove that big Plymouth and had a dent and a ding on all 4 corners. Why? Because he couldn't drive? Because he only had one eye? That's true. He only had one eye. But alcohol contributed greatly. And drunkenness can be funny. Some of Hollywood's funniest actors playing the role of a drunk. I mean, think about Otis Campbell and the Andy Griffith Show. They can be hilarious. And I laugh at them just like you would. But when we get down to the bottom line, where the rubber hits the road, alcoholism is not funny. It's too serious to be funny. And God gives us a declaration. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. So I've got a dog in this fight. I've seen firsthand what it'll do, and I thank the Lord for the deliverance that He's willing to bring to those who are willing to turn. Not only is there a declaration concerning alcohol, but number 2, notice the destruction from alcohol. The destruction of alcohol. It's right here in our text over and over. We have things that characterize the lifestyle of the alcoholic and the behavior of the drunkard. America's number one problem drug is not an illegal substance, but a legal drug called alcohol. It is responsible for the most death in our country, produces more death than any other drug. Over 55% of highway deaths are alcohol related. It causes heart problems, liver problems. It is an addictive substance. Time magazine said 1/2 of all murders are alcohol related. It is the most addictive. There are 17 million alcoholics in the United States today, and that number is rising, far outnumbering the addicts of any other drug. It produces the most misery, death, disability, psychosis, addiction. It can ruin marriages and become the direct cause of divorce. It can turn teens into rebels who ruin their lives. It can turn normally gentle, docile men into wife beaters. It can cause children to be deprived. It can send people to an early grave. Another consequence of alcohol is despair. Look at verse 29. The Bible says, "Who has woe?" The Hebrew word translated woe there is an expression of despair, a feeling of hopelessness and impending doom. Woe is that overwhelming feeling that there's nothing you can do about it. There's a life spinning out of control, that you're being crushed under its pressure. Woe is the suicide note of a troubled 16-year-old girl. It's the despair of a middle-aged man who gives up on life. In fact, it's no coincidence that 40% of all suicide attempts each year in our nation are alcohol-related. Despair is a natural consequence of drug and alcohol intoxication. The text goes on, who has sorrow, who has contentions, or who has strife. The idea of strife focuses on the consequence of broken relationships. Strife is a general word that refers to arguments with other people. Again, it's no coincidence that 80% of all domestic abuse in our nation is alcohol-related. Want to drive a wedge between a husband and wife? Want to drive a wedge between a parent and a child? Want to drive a wedge between two friends? Social drinking is a great place to start driving that wedge. Every 20 minutes in our country, one person is killed in an alcohol-related automobile crash. I'm sure that number goes up dramatically during holiday weekends like the two that we find ourselves in between. According to National Geographic, alcohol abuse costs American society $136 billion and 65,000 lives every year. In other words, intoxication with alcohol will cause a person to have lots of problems and difficulties that they would not have otherwise had. Whether it's a suspended driver's license because of a DUI, an unwanted pregnancy because of poor decision-making skills, or a ruined relationship or a lost job. Whether it's driving a car while intoxicated or jumping off a rock into a lake, intoxicated people take needless risks that often harm themselves. Again, it's not a coincidence that 60% of all emergency room admissions are alcohol-related. We see those kind of things alluded to in the text. Verse 33, the Bible says, your eyes will see strange things, your heart will utter perverse things. You'll be like one up and down, staggering, on a ship who lies down in the midst of the sea, or who clings to the top of the mast. While it is the most dangerous drug in the world, there's no warning label on the bottle. The can doesn't read #1 producer of death, #1 producer of addicts, or #1 producer of misery. But alcohol is destructive. Not only is alcohol destructive, number 3, alcohol is deceptive. Don't you hate being deceived, being fooled, letting somebody pull one over on you? I said this book gave us many words concerning alcohol. Notice chapter 20 and verse 1. If you want to turn back, fine. If you just want to listen, that's fine also. The Bible says in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1, wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler or raging, and whoever is led astray or deceived by it is not wise. In other words, alcoholic beverage has a deceptive nature to it.